Hello, everyone. Maggie Sanchez, your Chair for Education Committee. Once again, bringing you the best Gov to go over the RPA. Any questions that you guys have? We've now been using it for a few months. So please make sure you have your notebook ready. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And myself and Wendy will be going over the questions. So Gov, I'll let you take the stage.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good to see you on Zoom. Maybe this is the last time I see you on Zoom. I think I'm going to see you live and in person next time. Fingers crossed, right? Fingers crossed. But unless anything changes, that'll be the deal. But what I'm doing today, we're still doing by Zoom. This is like an hour-and-a-half session on the purchase contract. We still do these 4-hour classes if you're interested, but those aren't free. But this is free, obviously. I'm just going to basically go through the form, just highlighting everything that's the important changes. I'm assuming you know the other part, but the important changes is what I'm going to be covering. As Maggie said, you've been doing this for a while. Hopefully you've got most of it already, but there's still things that I know that are coming up, and there's still things that not everyone's aware of. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the form itself. Let's see here. All right. All right. So, as you know, when you get the purchase contract, you get other forms that go with it, right? The agency form and fair housing form and PRBS form and the wire fraud form, and here we are, the contract, right? You can all see that, right? All right. By the way, before I even start, there's going to be a note in July 1st, a month and a half from now, there's going to be a new attachment to the purchase contract. There's a new form coming out called the Fair Appraisal Act Addendum. And it's a new disclosure form. Your buyer and seller have to sign it. It's mandatory, but you're not going to have to think about it because it is going to be pre-attached. But you know, all these other advisories that are attached to the form, they're not actually required that your clients sign. Of course, you want your clients to sign them, but if they don't, it's not illegal. But this new form that's coming out July 1st, Fair Appraisal Act Addendum, that's going to be something your clients are required to sign by law. So it shouldn't be too hard, but anyway. All right, here we are, the purchase contract. You know, I've been doing this a long time, since way before Maggie was born. I've been doing this, and I remember when the purchase contract was 2 pages, then it was 4 pages, then it was 6 pages, then it was 8 pages, then it was 10 pages. It was 10 pages a long time. Forms Committee said, let's keep it at 10. But then this past year, the Forms Committee said, you know, a lot of things have changed, and a lot of issues keep coming up time and time again. Maybe we should put things in the purchase contract covering these issues, so when the issue comes up, people don't have to argue about it. It's covered in the purchase contract. Of course, if we do this, it's going to result in the purchase contract being longer, but that's the price we're willing to pay. So that's exactly what the Forms Committee did, and the result is it went from 10 pages to 16. Now, I think you've probably noticed this. It's not that there are a lot of new paragraphs in the contract. It's just that within the paragraphs you're familiar with, there's more stuff, basically more explanations, which will help you. But the other big change, of course, is paragraph 3, where the Forms Committee, they pulled out of all of the big contract, big paragraphs, they pulled out the parts that people negotiate on, the deal points, the contract terms, the negotiating terms. Every deadline, every number, everything you negotiate on is all in the same place, which I think is good because, number one, you can't miss it, right? You're not going to skip a blank that's important because it's all there. And number two, I think you can always go back to it and refer back to, what did they say about that? Well, you can always go back to that paragraph. Plus, if you're comparing offers, comparing one offer to another, all you got to really look at is paragraph 3, right? Because that's where all the big numbers are. Anyway, having said that, I'm just going to go through this, okay? And I'll watch the chat myself. So if anything comes up, just put it in the chat. I'll keep a track of that. All right, paragraph 1. You know, only one thing changed here. You know, it used to say the real property to be acquired. Now it says the property. You know why it says that? Because we no longer have a manufactured mobile home purchase contract. If you're going to buy a mobile home, use this form and the manufactured home addendum, which means you can use this form to buy personal property mobile home. So obviously, this form is not just real property, it's property. That's not a big deal. Paragraph 2, agency. The only thing that changes is this one statement here. Look at this. Buyer's agent not legally required to give to the seller's agent the AD form signed by buyer. Seller's agent not legally obligated to give the buyer's agent AD form signed by seller. We still hear that occasionally from agents. They say, the other agent won't give me their agency form. And the answer is, they don't have to. You only give the agency form to your own client. You don't need the one that the other agent gave to their client. But if this issue ever comes up anymore, you just have to say, look what it says. It says that right in the contract. So let's not argue about that. You give your agency, I'll give my agency. I don't need yours, you don't need mine. Okay, paragraph 3, the big, I call it the grid. Paragraph 3 has all the deal points. Most of the things in this paragraph are not new to you. They've just been all pulled together, but there are a couple of new things. So let's just go through this. First thing, of course, you want to know is the price, but then look at this, all cash. Isn't that nice that you find out right away whether it's a cash offer? Remember the old form? It wasn't until paragraph 3 in the financing on the second page, you find out it was a cash offer. That's the first thing you want to know. All right, it's a cash offer. By the way, if this box is checked, that automatically removes the loan contingency. This contract has 8 buyer contingencies. But if you pay all cash, just checking this box, all of a sudden you only have 7 buyer contingencies, which I'll talk about in a second. Close of escrow. The only thing I want to point out here, very important, close of escrow, so many days after acceptance. What does that mean? I mean, you could pick a number or you could pick a date. Don't do both. If you want to close on June 15th, write June 15th and leave this blank. But if you want to close a certain number of days after acceptance, don't put the date, just put the number. Let's say I write 45. What am I saying? I'm saying day of acceptance is day 0. And since it says days, I'm going to count every day, Saturday, Sunday, Memorial Day, every day. But if the last day is a Saturday or a Sunday or a holiday where the recording office isn't open, you go to the next day the recording office is open. And that's true every time in this contract. It says days. That means count every day, but the ending day has to be a business day. But then over here we have how long is the offer good for? Well, the offer is good for 3 calendar days. You know what that means? So the day they sign it is day 0. Then you count every day. But if the 3rd day is a weekend, that's the deadline. So if you wrote an offer today, right? Thursday, today's day 0. The offer is good until Friday, day 1, Saturday, Sunday at 5, the offer expires. In other words, that's a deadline that can occur on a weekend. But you know what? This is the only place in the contract where it uses the word calendar days. Then what about the deadline to put your deposit into escrow? Well, that says business days. What does that mean? That means when you're counting days, you don't even count Saturday and Sunday. So for example, you had your offer accepted today, Thursday. What would be your deadline to open escrow? Well, tomorrow, Friday, would be day 1. We don't count Saturday and Sunday. Monday would be business day 2. Tuesday would be business day 3. That would be your deadline. But you know what? This is the only place in the contract where it says business days. This is the only place where it says calendar days. There are a couple of addenda that use calendar days, but as far as this contract is concerned, it's always days other than these two, which means you count every day, but the last day has to be a business day. Okay? That's not new. I just want to point that out to you. Now, there's a couple of new things here. And that is, what does it mean to accept an offer? And this is the only time I'm going to do is I'm going to jump ahead real quick to the definitions. Okay? So let's look at the definition of acceptance. It's kind of important. To accept an offer. Acceptance means the offer is fully executed by the recipient and delivered to the other side. In other words, to accept an offer, it's not enough to sign it, you got to deliver it. Buyer has to sign it, then the seller has to sign it and deliver it back to the agent. Counteroffer, seller signs it, buyer has to sign it and deliver it to the other agent. If you don't deliver it, you don't have a deal. Okay, great. The question is, what does deliver mean? Well, that's what's changed. And this is a big deal. Deliver. What does it mean to deliver something? Well, when I deliver something, it's effective when it's personally received. Okay, great. Personally received by the client or the agent. Remember, you can always deliver to the agent. You never have to deliver to the client. So what does personal receipt mean? Well, there's two choices now. Number one is the old definition. Personal receipt means a copy. It doesn't have to be the original. The copy or a link is in my possession. The problem is we always send things electronically, like email. And the question has always been, what does it mean to be in possession of an email? For example, if I send you an email and it's in your inbox, but you haven't opened it, is it in your possession? Believe it or not, the courts have never decided that. So for 30 years, I've been telling realtors, when you send an email to the other side, follow up with them, call them up and say, did you open up my email? I need you to acknowledge that you opened my email, because that was the only way you were sure that they received it. But now look, here's the new thing. There's a second definition of personal receipt. Personal receipt also means an electronic copy of the document or a link has been sent to the designated electronic delivery address specified on page 16. Okay, here's what I'm talking about. This is new. On the last page of the contract, last page of the contract, when you guys sign it, put in your broker's name and your DRE number, there's this new thing here where you put your designated electronic delivery address. So let's say I'm the buyer's agent. So I come to this point, I put my email. And you're the listing agent and you put your email. Here's what I'm telling you. I'm saying to you, listing agent, if you need to send me something, send it here. Don't send it anywhere else. Send it right where I tell you to. But if you send it, that's considered delivered. It doesn't matter whether I open it or not. It doesn't even matter if it goes to my spam. That's not your fault. You emailed it to where I told you. As soon as you press send, it's considered delivered. No more of this game. I didn't get your email. I'm sorry. I must have gone to my spam, or it's in my inbox. I never opened it. It doesn't matter if it's in your inbox and you never opened it. It doesn't matter if it went to spam. If I can prove I sent it where you told me to, or you can prove you sent it where you told me to, that's considered delivery. So I still think it's a good practice when you send someone an email to follow up and say, hey, just want to make sure you got my email. But that's not actually necessary, because if you sent it, and obviously you have a record of where you sent it, that's considered delivery. You know what that means to all of us? That means we have to check our emails. And we got to make sure it didn't go to spam. Maybe you whitelist the other agent for this deal so that their emails come directly to you. And it's not an excuse to say, well, it's in my inbox, I never opened it. Doesn't matter. If I send you an email at 3 o'clock in the morning, you received it at 3 o'clock in the morning, not when you opened it. So you see what I'm saying? This is kind of a big deal. Now, what if the agent, on the other hand, I've noticed this happening a lot where agents don't fill this in. They don't fill in the designated email address. You know what that means? We're back to the way we were before, which means if I send you an email, you can always say, I never got it. Prove that I got it. And then if, if you didn't get it, it's in your spam or something, I didn't send it. So the burden is on the old way, that the burden is on the person who sends it to follow up and say, please acknowledge you got my email. But with this new system, if you fill in this blank, the burden is on the recipient. You told me where to send it. I sent it where you told me. So now it's your problem if you didn't get it. See what I'm saying? That's a big deal. To me, that's the most significant change. Yes, Karina, you can definitely record this. This is that's the most significant change in the whole form. Okay. All right. Now I'm not going to skip ahead anymore. We're just going to go in order. All right. So paragraph 3, we got the concept here. Here's something that's different. We talk about the deposit. Remember all these years in real estate, when you deposit, you had the option. You could use a cashier's check, you could use a personal check, you could give it to the agent, you could send it directly to escrow. You have no choice anymore. The deposit will be sent by wire transfer. No checks, no cashier's checks, no giving it to the agent, wire transfer. What if you don't like that? Well, you could check this box and write something different. But if you don't write anything different, it defaults to automatic. All right. Okay. What about increased deposit? Do you have to do an increased deposit? Of course not. If you do an increased deposit, though, there's a new form that you have to use at the time you do it. It's actually the same form that was before, the RID. Now it's the same form, different name. But here's something new. Let's say I want to do an increased deposit. When am I going to give you the increased deposit? Well, now it defaults to upon removal of contingencies. You can put something different, but if you leave it blank, there's a default now. There wasn't a default in the old form. On the old form, if you were going to do an increased deposit, you did have to say when you're going to do the increased deposit. Now, it's presumed that if you are going to do an increased deposit, it's presumed that's when you're going to do it. You don't have to. You don't have to do it at all. And if you do it, you can do it at a different time, but there is a presumption now. Okay, so that's a new thing. By the way, have you ever had a buyer who they write an offer, it's accepted, and then they never put the deposit in? And they think, well, since I never put my money in, nothing bad can happen to me. That's not true. If you put a deposit in, and then you cancel the deal before you put the deposit in, the seller can still sue you for damages if you've damaged them. Of course, you probably still have your contingencies, but you still have to act in good faith. If you just cancel before you even put the money in, how is that acting in good faith? Unless something happened that's legitimate that changed your mind. So that keeps coming up on the hotline now. Buyers canceling deals before they even put the deposit in, thinking, oh, I didn't put the deposit in, no problem. Not necessarily. All right, loan amount. If you're a cash buyer, you don't need to fill this in. You can if you want to. Sellers like it if you fill it in, but you don't have to. But if you're not a cash buyer, that means your offer is contingent on getting a loan. Meaning if you don't get the loan, you don't have to buy the house. But you got to tell the seller what loan you're trying to get. Because you have to make a good faith effort to get this loan. And if you qualify for this loan, you can't use the loan contingency to get out of the deal. And remember, I'm about to tell you, the contract now gives the seller and the listing agent the right to contact your lender to see what's up with the loan process. So if the lender tells the seller, yep, the buyer qualified for this loan, then the buyer can't say, well, I'm sorry, based on the loan contingency, I'm not buying your house. Oh no, your lender told me you qualified for that loan. See what I'm saying? Anyway, it's very important that you fill this in. You're basically putting down what you're willing to take. the highest interest rate you're willing to pay. What about points? Remember on the old form, you always had to fill in how many points you were willing to take, but now it defaults to 0. So if you're saying my offer is contingent on getting a 0-point loan, you don't have to write 0. It defaults to 0, okay? If you're conventional, we're presuming that's the case. If you're FHA, VA, you check one of these 2 boxes. If you check one of these 2 boxes, there's another form that comes in. There are 2 other forms that attached. Remember on the old form, there was a 3rd form that attached. It was called the FVA. It's gone. What form is that? That's the form where you tell the FHA buyer, VA buyer tells the seller, these are the lender required repairs I want you to do. And you use the FVA to do that. Why is that form gone? Because the Forms Committee said, we already have a form to request repairs. It's called the RR. We don't need a separate form just to request FHA repairs. So that's why that form is gone, in case you missed it. By the way, you still have a deadline. Remember, if you're an FHA or VA buyer, you have 17 days to ask the seller to deliver the list of the repairs you want. Seller can say no, that seller doesn't have to can do it, but you got 17 days to ask. What if you don't ask in 17 days? You're actually in breach of contract. The seller can say, you need to ask me, you need to tell me within 17 days whether or not you want me to do anything. That's a deadline. Remember, all of paragraph 3 is all deadlines. And for now, we're just talking about buyer deadlines. These are all the buyer deadlines. Closing, how long is the offer good for, when they're going to put the deposit in. Here's a deadline. When are they going to request the repairs? These are all deadlines. Here's another new. Remember, in the old form, you didn't find out till paragraph 9 if the buyer is going to live there or not. Now you find out right away. It's presumed it's their primary residence, or they're buying a second home or an investment. Why does the seller care what the buyer's plans are? Well, for one thing, if they say it's a second home, remember, under liquidated damages, the seller isn't limited to 3% of the price. So on a primary residence sale, no matter how much the deposit is, if the buyer backs out, the seller only keeps 3% of the price. But if it's a second home and the deposit happens to be more than 3% of the purchase price, and the buyer backs out, the seller keeps the whole deposit, even though it's more than 3%. So the seller wants to know if it's a second home. Investment property, why does the seller care? They don't really care, but maybe that's telling them they don't need to kick the tenant out, right? Okay. Second page. Let's say you want to ask for a seller credit in the offer. On the old form, you had to write that in. Seller will credit buyer, blah, blah, blah. Well, you don't have to write it in anymore. You can just check a box and write a number. And on the old form, you had to say, seller will credit buyer, blah, 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 applied towards closing costs. Well, you don't actually have to write that in anymore because it's presumed if you're asking for a credit, you want it applied to closing costs. Okay? We still have the additional financing terms box, but you don't need it for this anymore. Then we have these 3 deadlines. You know what I like about this? All 3 of these deadlines are all right next to each other. This is the all cash buyers deadline to prove funds. This is the loan buyers deadline to prove they have enough money for the down payment and closing costs. And this is the loan buyers deadline to provide a letter. Remember in the old form, these were 3 different places? I think it's good they're all together. You know what else is good? Remember on the old form, buyer always had 3 days to provide this documentation. Now it's different. It's presumed that you've attached it. If you want to delay it for 3 days, you can check a box, but the presumption is, and obviously it's the best practice, right, is to attach it. Now, another new thing. Remember on the old form, it said buyer has 3 days to provide a pre-approval or a pre-qualification letter, but it didn't say which one. The seller had to figure out which one it was. Now the buyer is going to tell the seller, this letter I'm attached, I'm going to tell you right now, it's a pre-qual letter or it's a pre-approval letter. And you have a third choice. Maybe I've actually got loan approval. I mean, pre-approval subject to the property, of course, but some lenders will give you that now, and that's a third option. Okay. All right. Walkthrough. On the old form, you didn't find out till paragraph 16 when the buyer gets a walkthrough, but that's a deadline. That's a negotiable term. So now it's moved up. Of course, the presumption is just like on the old form that your walkthrough is within the last 5 days. Here's a new thing. Can a buyer assign their interest to another buyer in the middle of escrow? Yes, with the seller's permission, but the seller has to be reasonable. Here's the new thing. You have to ask for this within the first 17 days. What if I wait till after 17 days to request an assignment? The seller can say no, and they don't even have to be reasonable. If you ask for an assignment in the first 17 days, the seller has to say yes, unless they have a good reason to say no. You can always change this number though, right? Maybe the buyer's thinking, you know, I think I might need a cosigner when it comes down to it, but I'm not going to find out if I need a cosigner until towards the end of escrow. By the way, a cosigner is a partial assignment. So you are going to need the seller's permission. So maybe if I'm anticipating I'm going to need a cosigner, I'm going to change this number to like more than 17. I'm going to put it like 45, right? By the way, you'll see when we get to paragraph 23, if a buyer wants to assign their interest to their own entity, like their own trust or their own LLC, you can do that whenever you want, and you don't need the seller's permission. Okay? All right. Now let's get into the contingencies. You know what? I think this is my favorite thing in the new contract. All the contingencies are in the same place. I mean, for 25 years, I've been telling people buyers have 8 contingencies. And then someone would say, where are they? And I would have to say, well, there's some in paragraph 3, 4, paragraph 8, paragraph 10, paragraph 12, paragraph 13. They're all together now. I love it. You can always go look in one place to check out the contingencies. They're all together, and they all have the same deadline too. You can change any of these numbers, but they start out the same. And they're listed in order.
Now got
Big 8. Okay. Now, a couple of interesting things to look at here. I say there's, you know what a contingency, that's something in a contract that gives me the right to get out of it. These are all buyer contingencies. Are there any seller contingencies in this contract? No. But that doesn't mean a seller couldn't add a contingency in a counteroffer. Seller can always say, my counteroffer is, I'm accepting your offer contingent on finding a replacement property in 17 days. So if the seller does that and the buyer accepts it, now the seller has a contingency. But without that, in the basic contract itself, there's just 8 contingencies and they're all buyer. But there's something unique about the 8th one. Remember, I mean, you understand loan contingent on getting a loan, property appraising, being okay with the inspections, being okay with the documents, the prelim, the HOA docs, the solar lease. But what if I want to make my offer contingent on selling my house first? That's not automatic. You have to check a box and you got to fill out a form. So if you don't check this box, you've only got 7 contingencies. If you check this box, you have 8. But have you noticed here, there's no deadline to remove it. Because if I make my offer to you contingent on selling my house first, that contingency, I don't have to remove it. That contingency is never removed. It's not removed until I sell my house. If I never sell my house, I can get out of the deal. So there's no deadline to remove it. But on this form, though, I do have to tell you when my house is scheduled to close. And if my house doesn't close when it's supposed to, if you look at this COP form, the seller can give the buyer a 2-day notice to perform, say, hey, you told me your house is going to close on June 5th, Here we are, June 5th. Your house hasn't closed yet. I'll give you 2 more days. If you don't close your house in 2 days, I'm canceling the whole deal. So there is a risk to the buyer of making your offer contingent on selling your house first. The risk is if your house doesn't sell on time, the seller can use that as an excuse to cancel the whole deal. Okay. Loan contingency. Remember, if you're an all cash buyer, it's automatically removed. If you check this box, no loan contingency. But let's say you're a loan buyer. Has this been happening in your area at all? Some places I talk to, buyers, to make their offer look more competitive, are removing their loan contingency in the offer. How do you do that? You check this box. What does that mean? That means if you don't get the loan, you don't have an excuse. Yeah, but I got other contingencies. I've seen some buyers nowadays, they remove all of their contingencies in their offer. This is a risky thing to do, of course. This means if something comes up about the property you don't like, too bad. You removed your contingencies. If you don't get the loan, it doesn't appraise, too bad. You're going to lose your deposit. By the way, if I do want to make a non-contingent offer, how do I do it? Well, for the loan and the appraisal contingency, you just check these boxes. If you want to remove 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you would have to attach the CR, the contingency removal form, and remove them. Some people ask me, can't I just write 0 under days of acceptance? That's not really good enough. That doesn't really remove the contingency. That's just telling the seller you promised to remove it. But the sellers, you still haven't removed it. You just promised. So the seller can give you, if you don't give them a contingency removal, they can give you a notice to perform. But it still doesn't, just saying you're going to remove it doesn't remove it. If you really want to make a non-contingent offer, you have to attach a contingency removal form, and on that form, you're going to check the box. Okay? Here's something new. All these years, when you make your offer, it's contingent on the property appraising at the purchase price. Look at it now. You can say to the seller, my offer is contingent on the property appraising at the purchase price or a different number. Let's say the purchase price is $500,000, but you're thinking it might not appraise at that. So you say, my offer is contingent on appraising at $475,000. If the purchase price is $500,000, but your contingency is $475,000, does that mean the buyer is promising that they will make up the difference? Not necessarily. You have to say that. You have to be very clear that what the buyer is saying is, I will pay out of my pocket the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price. You know what I've noticed? Some buyers think that if they say it appraises at $475,000, that it's contingent on appraising at $475,000, even though I wrote the price is $500,000, and if it appraises at $475,000, the seller has to lower the price to $475,000. Is that true? No, unless you say so. So you have to be very specific. If you want to say to the seller, my offer to you is I will pay whatever the appraiser says it's worth, and the seller agrees to that, then the seller has to lower the price to the appraised value. But you have to be very specific when you're doing that. My point is, if you're going to mess around with the appraisal, you might want to call the legal hotline so we can tell you exactly how to word it. We're going to figure out what exactly are you trying to say here. And are you going to make up the difference? Are you asking the seller to reduce the price? What are you trying to do here? And there's a right way to do it. Okay. All right. Remind you of this. Do you all know this, right? If you're an FHA or VA buyer, even if you remove the appraisal contingency, if it doesn't appraise, you still can get out of the deal. Under federal law, FHA, VA buyers, it doesn't matter whether you have an appraisal contingency, you're protected. Here's an important thing to point out. You got so many days to remove your contingency on inspections. But did you know you have a whole separate deadline to actually access the property? Maybe you're going to say, I'll remove my investigation contingency in 10 days. You can still have extra time after that to come onto the property. These are two different deadlines. You know what else? You can even have a non-contingent offer, but you still have the right to do inspections. Just because your contingency is removed, you still have the right to do inspections. You still have the right to enter the property for a certain number of days. Of course, the seller may counter that too, down to 0, whatever. It's up to them. These first 3 contingencies, that's a hard deadline. You can change it to more or less, but whatever deadline that is, to extend it, you need the seller's permission. But these deadlines here to review the seller doc, that means to review the disclosures, maybe they gave you the previous buyer inspections, whatever, they gave you a termite report, anything the seller gave you, you can review it. The prelim, you can review it. HOA docs, if there are any, solar lease docs, if there are any. That's not a hard deadline, because if the seller is late delivering this stuff, you have extra time. So maybe you don't even get the prelim until day 16. Well, you have until day 21 to remove it. You don't even get the HOA docs until day 24. You have until day 29 to remove them. So whatever comes last, 17 days or 5 days after you get them, that's the deadline to remove these. The first 3, that's a hard deadline. These can be changed depending on when you receive the document. Okay? All right. So those are all the buyer deadlines, pretty much all of them, right? We've talked about every deadline the buyer has. Now we're going to talk about the seller's deadlines, M and N. What's the first seller deadline? The deadline to move out. Well, when does the seller move out? First, you got to figure out what time, then you got to figure out what day. The time is, we're presuming, if you don't check a box, that whenever it records, the seller leaves. If it records at 10 o'clock, you leave at 10. If it records at 2:30, you leave at 2:30. But that's kind of uncertain, right? You don't want that. Maybe you want a specific, okay, doesn't matter when it records. The day it records at 6 o'clock is when I'm leaving. Okay. But we got to figure out, what day does the seller have to leave? If it's seller occupied or vacant, we're assuming it's the closing date, but it might not be. You may be giving the seller extra time. If you're giving them up to 29 days, you're going to check this box, and then the seller in possession addendum attaches. If you're giving them 30 or more, you're going to check this box, and then the residential lease after sale attaches. These 2 forms are now mandatory. In the old form, they were recommended. But now, if the seller is going to stay, you need to fill out this form. You notice there's no opportunity here for the seller to move out before close of escrow, because that's a terrible idea. You never let the buyer move in before close. Okay. How does the buyer know how much time the seller wants? Because the listing agent is going to tell you. If they don't tell you, then they have to do a counteroffer. You don't want a counteroffer. Okay. Here's a new thing. Let's say you're buying a house with a tenant already there. The question is, what's up with the tenant? Are they going to leave before close? Are they going to leave on the closing day? Are they going to stay beyond the closing date? We need to figure out what's up with the tenant. On the old form in paragraph 9, it used to say tenants have to be out 5 days prior to close. There's nowhere in the contract to do that anymore. To deal with the tenant, you have to use this addendum. This is pretty much a mandatory addendum if you're buying a house. If the day you write the offer, there's a tenant there, you need to deal with the tenant, which means you have to attach this form, and you're going to say to the seller what you want the tenant, when you want the tenant to be gone. Or maybe the seller's going to tell you, I'm sorry, they're on a lease. The lease isn't over until a couple of weeks after close, whatever. This is where you talk about that. This is also where you talk about what happens if the tenant's not gone. If the tenant's supposed to be gone on the closing day and I'm ready to close and the tenant's still there, what are my options? Can I cancel the whole deal? Can I delay closing until they move out? Do I have to close with the tenant and kick them out myself? You're going to deal with that on this form. See what I'm saying? It's like a mandatory addendum. Okay. Vera, what's the difference between a partial assignment and a full assignment? What I mean by that is if I assign 100% of my interest to another person, that's a full assignment. But if I'm just adding a buyer, so it's going to be, we're each going to be 50%, that's a partial. Jane, yes, I'm going to talk about this in a second. Even if you've removed your contingencies, the buyer still has a 5-day right to cancel based on the disclosures, not just the TDS and NHD, but there's 3 others I'll mention in a second. So good question, hold on. All right, other seller deadlines. They got 7 days to make sure the buyer gets everything. I want to point something out. When I say the offer's contingent on reviewing seller documents, that means like the disclosure forms and the previous buyer's inspections or whatever. When I say the seller has to deliver documents, that means not just the disclosures, that means prelim, CC&Rs, solar lease, all of that stuff, whether it's generated by the seller or ordered by the seller, you got to give it to the buyer within 7 days. Some of these things take longer than 7 days, so you might want to order them before you sell the house, before you put the house on the market, okay? Skip 2 for a second. 3, not only do you have 7 days to make sure the buyer gets certain documents, you got 3 days to pay the HOA to order them. By the way, you don't want to wait 3 days. You want to order the HOA docs early. So there's a possibility you're actually going to get them to the buyer within 7 days. Here's a new deadline. Under the old form, what was the seller's deadline to put in the smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors? Close of escrow. Now it's 7 days. Seller, you don't wait till close. Within 7 days, you put in the smoke detectors and the carbon monoxide detector, and you strap the water heater. If you don't do it in 7 days, the buyer can give you a notice to seller to perform, and 2 days later, they can cancel. So those are the seller deadlines: moving out, delivering documents, paying the HOA, installing. Then we have 2 and 5. Those are buyer and seller deadlines. Whether you're the buyer or the seller, when the escrow company or the title company gives you documents to sign, you got to return them in 5 days. That's a deadline. And if you, the buyer or the seller, are not a person, you're a thing, the buyer's a trust, it's a corporation, it's an LLC, it's a partnership, somebody has to, some human being has to sign on behalf of that person. Whoever that person is, they have 3 days after acceptance to deliver to the agent on the other side proof that you are the right person to sign. If it's a trust, you got to provide proof that you're the trustee. If it's a corporation, you got to provide proof that the corporate documents authorize you to sign. So that's not new, but that's a buyer and seller deadline. So in paragraph 3, A through L are buyer deadlines. M is obviously a seller deadline. N1, N3, and 4 are seller deadlines. N2 and 5 are buyer and seller deadlines. All right. Paragraph 9. When you buy a house, what are you buying? You're buying the house, the land, and everything attached to the house or built into the house, or something that for which there's a special opening has been made. The problem is sometimes the buyer and seller don't agree. I think that refrigerator is built in. I don't think it is built in. I think that microwave is built in. I don't think it's really built in. So they argue about it. And then sometimes you got to go in front of a judge to determine whether it's truly built in or not. Well, to avoid the judge, it's a lot easier to just to deal with it in the contract. So these are all the debatable items. So buyer, when you're writing the offer, if you want the refrigerator, check the box. If you want the wine cooler, check the box. If you want the video doorbell, check the box. If you want the jacuzzi, check the box. If you want the Tesla charge, in other words, ask for it. And if the seller doesn't counter you, that means the seller is agreeing to give it to you. So we don't care. We don't have to have a judge decide later. We've agreed in the contract who gets what. for some reason, the forms committee assumes the buyer always gets the bathroom mirrors, okay? What if there's something else in the house that you want, but you're not 100% sure it would be considered built in, and it's not listed here? Just write it in. What if there's something in the house you specifically don't want? Maybe there's a lighting fixture, maybe there's like a chandelier in the dining room. I mean, light fixtures are considered part of the house, but the buyer's thinking, I don't want that ugly chandelier. I got my own chandelier. Well, then you can specifically exclude it. And that's telling the seller to take it out. And whatever you do, don't rely on the MLS remarks. So the MLS remark says all refrigerators are included. The buyer says, great. And then they don't bother checking this box. Well, that means they don't get the refrigerators anymore. Because if the seller says they're offering them to you, but you don't check the box, the seller thinks, well, even though I offered them, they don't want them, so I'm going to take them. Whatever's in the MLS, whatever on the flyer, that's not part of the contract. This is the contract. So make sure you check the box, okay? Paragraph Q used to be paragraph 7. This is where the buyer and seller decide all the things we got to pay for that are not included in the purchase price. Who's going to pay? The only thing really new here is there's an option of both. You can say buyer's going to pay for all of it, seller's going to pay for all of it, or if you check both, it's 50-50. What if you want the buyer to pay 40% and the seller to pay 60%? You got to write that in, put it in the blank, okay? Remember Q1, 2, 3, that's when you're basically asking the seller to pay for stuff. I always say if the buyer's going to pay for, or like a buyer wants to get a roof report or a radon report or an asbestos report or a lead paint report, just do it. You don't have to write it in your offer that you're going to do it. You have the right to just do it. The only things you really want to write in the offer are the things that you're asking the seller to pay for. Everybody, some people still like to write it in if they want to. They want to tell the seller right up front they're going to do it, but they don't have to do that. That's not necessary, okay? So keep that in mind. Okay. Smoke alarms, remember that's a seller requirement, but the buyer can still pay for it. If the buyer is going to pay for it, check a box. But even if the buyer is going to pay for it, the seller still has to do it within the time. Okay. So Q4 and 5, these are things, 5 and 6 are local rules. I don't know if Visalia or anywhere you have has point of sale mandatory reports or upgrades. If you don't, it doesn't matter what you check. If you do, you determine who's going to pay. For the escrow fee, there's a new option now. You can say buyer pay all of it, seller pay all of it, 50-50, or each is going to pay their own share if you can figure that out from the bill. You want to look at the escrow bill, maybe talk to the escrow company or title company before you even get into escrow to see, are they breaking it down into buyer and seller? Okay. Anything else changed here? Well, in the old form, you could negotiate who's going to pay the HOA the fee for providing the HOA docs. Everyone, the forms said, but it said seller had to pay for the mandatory docs like the CC&Rs. You can negotiate the other docs like the minutes. That got too confusing. The forms committee said, let's just make it simple. Seller, you're always going to pay that fee. Here's another new thing slightly. What about the transfer fee? Some HOAs now, they don't just charge a transfer fee. They also charge an extra move out fee or a move in fee. What this is saying is, even if the seller, for example, agrees to pay the entire transfer fee, if there's a separate move out, move in fee, the buyer will pay. Buyer always pays the move in fee, seller pays the move out fee, which is different than the big old transfer fee. Okay. All right. All right, so we're done with the grid. There's no more deadlines, no more things to negotiate on. Pretty much the rest of the form is information, but there's still a few decisions you have to make. Paragraph 4 used to be paragraph 5. This is where you attach an addendum. 4A, there are new addendums. There are 5 new ones. There's no more probate purchase contract. If you're buying a probate, then simply use this form and attach a probate addendum. No more mobile home purchase contract, no more manufactured. You're buying a mobile home, use this form, check the box. Remember, I already told you this one. If you're buying a house with a tenant on it, there's nowhere in the contract to talk about the tenant, so you need this addendum. These last 2 don't come up very often, but there's some places in California now where it's become common, not common, but it happens, where instead of buying a fee simple interest in a property, like a condo, you buy a shared interest in the entire property with the right of possession of a unit. The point is, if that's the situation, we have an addendum for that. Some properties are owned by co-ops. We have an addendum for that. B are the old addendas. C are the advisories. Remember the difference between an addendum and an advisory? An addendum, you have to check the box. If you attach an addendum without checking the box, it doesn't count. You have to check a box and attach it, and both sides have to sign it. If one signs the addendum and the other doesn't, you don't have a contract. Advisories are different. They don't have to be signed by both. Advisories are just advice. You only give advice to your own clients. If I'm the buyer's agent, I don't need the seller to sign these advisories. I'm giving advice. If the seller wants to give it to their client, fine, get the seller to sign it. But these are presumed to be advisories the buyer's agent is giving to the buyer. Whatever it is, you never need the other side to sign your advisory because you're not giving advice to the other side, okay? Paragraph 5 and 6 is just sort of explanation stuff that used to be in paragraph 3. You're familiar with this stuff. There's a couple of new things I want to point out, though, okay? One new thing, I mentioned it before, is paragraph 5C1(3). Buyer, you are giving the seller and the listing agent permission to contact your lender to see the status of your application. And you actually have to give them the contact information. If the contact information that's on your pre-approval letter is different than the contact information that they can use to find out about the loan status, you got to give it to them. This is a new thing, okay? Here's another slightly new thing. Remember I said if you're an FHA or VA buyer, you got 17 days to ask the seller for about doing lender requirements. And now you use the RR for that. Look what it says now. You got a certain amount of time, probably 17, to deliver to seller notice of any lender requirements or that there are no lender requirements. In other words, if I'm an FHA or VA buyer, I got to tell the seller either way. I got to say, these are the repairs that I want you to do. Or there aren't. If you're going to request the repairs, you're going to use the request for repairs. If you're going to tell them that there's no lender requirements, use this form, which is the amendment to existing agreement, the amendment form. But you have to tell them either way. Okay, so that's a new thing. Nothing else is really new in these 2 paragraphs. Same old stuff. Paragraph 7 used to be 9 and 11 combined. Here's the change here, right? Have you ever closed escrow and the seller left some of their stuff behind? And you're like, is it trash? Is it property? Do they plan on coming and getting it? And it was never clear. You had to give them 18 days, arguably, to come back and get it. And if it was worth more than $600, you had to keep it for them. That's all gone. Good news for buyers. if the property, you know, if it says debris and personal property not included in the sale will be removed whatever day possession is available to the buyer. If items are not removed, all items shall be deemed abandoned. You can assume if the seller left it behind, they don't want it. Yeah, you got to give them 3-day warranty, only 3. You can email the seller if you have their email address, email their agent, write them a letter on regular mail. If you don't get a response in 3 days, you can do whatever you want. You can sell it, use it, keep it, destroy it, trash it. And you can also sue the seller for the cost of doing it. So this section is a lot more buyer friendly than it used to be. Paragraph 7C is new. All it's doing here is telling your clients, you know, if you're going to let the seller rent back, that sometimes affects your insurance and it sometimes affects your loan. So you're telling basically the buyer and the seller, if you're giving the seller the right to rent back, you should talk to your insurance advisor. Buyer should talk with your lender. Maybe you should talk to your lawyers. In other words, the realtor is not the legal expert to tell you the impact of a rent back on insurance or loans or whatever. Okay, so that's a new thing there. Okay. Kevin Lopez. So there's no valid contract if its addendum is checked and not signed. Exactly my point. Now, I know a lot of people don't know that, and they open escrow anyway, and everything runs smoothly. Why I'm mentioning this, though, is let's say this happens. Let's say I'm the buyer. I've removed all my contingencies. The 5-day right of rescission is over. I'm 5 days before close. I'm looking for a way to get out of the deal. If I figure out that there was an addendum checked in the offer that was never signed by both, that's an excuse to get out of the whole deal because we never had a valid contract. Okay. Jose, good point. Some of these TCs can be very mean, right? They're demanding that you sign this. That's their office, like you said, that's their office policy. They can't force the other side to sign it. Sometimes you just sign it to make the TC happy, right? Just make things work in real life. But you're right. Okay. Paragraph. Yeah, that's all I really want to say about paragraph 7. Everything else is the same. Paragraph 8. Remember, all the contingencies are in the paragraph 3 now. All paragraph 8 is just giving you a little bit of explanation and advice. There's a couple new things here. For one thing, this is very important. Paragraph 8A2. This is a reminder to the buyer that you don't wait till the last minute to check out the insurability of the property anymore. You need to investigate right away, early as possible, because insurance now can be a lot more expensive than you thought, or it can be unavailable. And then you have to go into the FAIR plan. And we're coming across lenders that are rejecting the FAIR plan insurance. Could screw up the whole deal. So you need to check this out early before you remove your investigation contingency. Because what you might find out about insurance, like not available or very expensive, that may change your whole decision on whether you want to go through with the deal. So, but you got to use the investigation contingency. If you remove the investigation contingency, all you have left is the loan contingency. And then you can't qualify for anything but the FAIR plan. And the lender says, we don't accept that. That's not grounds under the loan contingency to get your money back. Moral of the story, check out insurance before you remove your investigation of property contingency. So that's a new thing. Here's another interesting thing. Sometimes the appraiser gives you an opinion of square footage. If they give you an opinion, they say, wow, the appraiser doesn't think it's as big as I thought it was. I'm going to get out of the deal. Can you cancel based on the measurements in the appraisal. Once again, that falls within the investigation of property contingency. So if you've removed that and all you have left is the appraisal contingency, and the appraiser says, yeah, the property appraises, and by the way, this is what we think the square footage is, you cannot use that appraisal contingency to get out of the deal. Moral of the story, once again, don't remove your inspection contingency if you can help it until you get the appraisal, just in case the appraiser's opinion as to square footage is important to the buyer, as it is sometimes. So that's the appraisal contingency. Another comment I want to make is, your offer is contingent on reviewing the prelim. Well, now look what it says. The agreement is contingent upon buyer's ability to obtain the title policy provided in paragraph 13 and reviewing the prelim. You'll see when we get to 13, there's a specific type of title policy there. If the title company won't give me the title policy in paragraph 13, that's now grounds to cancel the deal. Here's another new thing. Have you ever had a title company give you a revised prelim in the middle of escrow? Well, guess what? Now that gives the buyer a new 5-day right to cancel. They have new contingency. If the revised prelim is different, if they're material or substantial deviations from the original one. But that's sort of a new contingency. If you get a revised prelim that has significant differences, that's a new way out of the deal. Okay. Another slightly new thing. Let's say, your offer is, let's say there's a solar lease. That means my offer is contingent on reviewing the solar lease. So I'm the buyer, I get the solar lease, I'm okay with it. So I apply to the solar company. I want to assume this lease. Solar company says yes. Great. But what if the solar company says the seller's going to have to pay a transfer fee? No. Look what it says here. Any assumption of the lease shall not require any financial obligation by the seller, which means seller can say, I ain't paying. You pay it. Otherwise, nope, we don't have a deal here. Okay, so that's a new thing too. Those are really the only new things when it talks about these contingencies. Paragraph 9, remember back in the grid in paragraph 3P, we talked about who gets this. Well, paragraph 9 is basically talking about everything other than those items. In other words, other than the refrigerators and the things like that, this covers everything else. This makes it clear. First of all, what I already told you, just because it's in the MLS, it's not part of the contract. And this makes very clear what is included. Fixtures, ceiling fans, inserts, built-in appliances, screens. There's some new stuff here. Window coverings is clearly now defined to include blinds, curtains, drapes, and shutters. Pool equipment now clearly includes motorized pool cleaners, pool nets, and pool covers. Light bulbs definitely include smart bulbs. In other words, these are all the things that are included. Also, back in 3P, it refers to security system. Well, this is telling you what a security system means. Paragraph 3 refers to home automation. This is telling you what that means. So there's just sort of more explanation of what is included. There's one other new thing here and that is, when it comes to the flat screen TV, it's not part of the house, but the bracket that is attaching the TV to the house is included. Remember on the old form, there was a checkbox to determine whether the buyer wants this bracket to remain or not. Now there's no checkbox. The presumption is, unless you've dealt with it back in paragraph 3, brackets will be removed. Okay, any brackets, unless you say otherwise, the presumption is the seller is going to remove it and fix it, not necessarily paint it. All right, paragraph 10. Remember, this used to be 7 and it was in the grid at Q. There's just a couple of other things that are to explain things here. The basic concept is, remember I said that even though it's the seller's responsibility to put in the smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detector, the buyer might agree to pay for it. This now explains how do you do that. If buyer's going to pay, buyer's going to work with escrow to deposit funds directly into escrow or directly to the vendor. What about if, I have no idea if your community has any point of sale mandates. If you do, and the buyer is going to pay for it, this explains how to pay for it. Next question. By the way, if LA, for example, has an automatic required plumbing upgrade, if there's a local point of sale retrofit, what is the deadline to do that? Answer: unless parties otherwise agree, such repair shall be completed prior to the walkthrough. So smoke detectors have to be put in 7 days. Any other repairs don't have to be done until the walkthrough. But what if they're late? You know, what if any repair is not completed on time? And this causes the lender to require a reinspection. Seller, you have to pay. I mean, after all, you were late doing the repairs. This costs the buyer money. Therefore, you pay. That's a new thing. Here's another new thing, is just telling your clients, if they start asking you questions, I have a question about the details of this required Los Angeles plumbing upgrade. You are advising your clients, buyer and seller are advised to seek information from a knowledgeable source. In other words, not you. By the way, who usually is a knowledgeable source? It's usually the building department of the city. All right. Paragraph 11 is the disclosure paragraph. Before I talk about what's new, just a quick review. Remember, buyers have 2 ways to get out of a deal. Number 1, they have contingencies. And until they remove their contingencies, they can get out of the deal, get their money back. But even if they've removed their contingencies already, the disclosures also give them the right to cancel. They have 5 days. Some people say, I thought it was 3 days. Well, it's 3 days if you deliver the disclosure in person on paper. Nobody does that. So basically, buyers have 5 days to cancel the deal upon receiving the disclosures. Okay. Do they have to receive it or their agent? Their agent. So if I'm the listing agent, I give the disclosures to the buyer's agent today. And the buyer's agent doesn't give it to the buyer until tomorrow. The day the agent got it was day 0 to count the days. Which are the disclosures that give the buyer the right to cancel? There are 5 of them. Number 1, TDS. Number 2, NHD. Number 3, other statutory. Happily for you, all the other ones are on the SPQ. Or if it's an exempt deal, they're on the ESD. So the first one is the TDS, second one, NHD, third one, SPQ. If you're exempt from the TDS because it's a probate, REO, bankruptcy, or trust sale, no TDS, no SPQ, then it's just the exempt seller disclosure. So most deals, it's TDS, NHD, and SPQ. On exempt deals, it's only 2 of them, NHD and ESD. The 4th big disclosure is the lead one, which is only required if the house is built before 78. The 5th big disclosure is the new one, FHDS. This doesn't apply every listing. It only applies if your listing is in a high or very high fire zone. High or very high fire zone, which you determine from the NHD report. If you're in a probate REO bank, if you're exempt from a TDS, you're exempt from this also, even if you're in a high or very high fire zone. If you're not exempt from the TDS and you're in a high or very high fire zone, this form is going to be required. You got to give it to the buyer. If you don't give it, if you give it late, they have 5 days from receipt. This form is going to be tweaked in about a month and a half on July, sometime in June. I think you're going to like it. Right now, it's a little bit confusing. it's going to sort of have like it's going to have a format of like, if you answer questions on it, it's going to help you how to fill it out. Okay. You'll see. It hasn't been totally finalized yet, but I think you're going to like it. Okay. So those are the big disclosures. Remember, buyer, when you get the disclosures, you are required to sign them and return them. Even if your deadline to do that, by the way, is 17 days or 5 days after you receive it, whichever happens last. In other words, maybe you receive the disclosures right up front, the 5 days are gone, you no longer have the right to cancel. You still have a deadline to sign and return them. What if I don't sign and return them? That's another excuse for the seller to cancel the buyer. Okay. So remember, two different things here. Contingencies give you the right to cancel. These disclosures give you the right to cancel. You know what's confusing about this? One of your contingencies is seller documents. Seller documents includes the disclosures. In other words, if you really think about it, if you give me the disclosures on day 3 or something, all right, I got 5 days after that to cancel the deal. But as long as I still have my contingency for seller documents, I actually have all the way until day 17 to cancel the deal based on the disclosures. It's kind of confusing how that works, but it's always worked that way. Remember, if you've done all of your disclosures, the buyer's okay with it, the buyer's removed all their contingencies, but then something new comes up. Seller, you have to give to the buyer an updated disclosure, and that gives them a new 5-day right to cancel. Okay? All right. Remember, the only really new thing in this paragraph is there's now this 5th big disclosure. By the way, when I say big disclosure, I mean disclosure that gives the buyer 5-day right to cancel. There are other disclosures that are required, but they don't give a right to cancel. One of them is the FERPTA form or the QS form. By the way, the deadline for that is close of escrow, and it doesn't give the buyer the right to cancel if it's late. What about the HOA docs? Those are required. You have a contingency. You don't have to remove the contingency until you get them, but there's no separate statutory right to cancel. What about the earthquake guide and the environmental hazards booklet? They are required, but they don't give you a right to cancel. Okay. Paragraph, now I'm going to go really fast because there are not many changes left. Paragraph 12 is just like paragraph 12 in the old form. Is there any, I mean, it's formatted, you got all these nice subparagraphs, it's easier to read, but are there any substantive changes here? Just a couple. One of them is, remember, when you're a buyer, you can do any inspection you want as long as you don't damage the property. To damage the property, you need seller's consent. However, there's always been an exception. Minimally invasive testing required to do a termite report. In other words, the termite guy or gal is going to drill some holes. You can do that without seller's permission. But now, look, if it involves drilling through stucco or similar material, you can't even do it as part of a termite report without the seller's consent. Here's a nice change. Years and years, people asked, is the seller required to move their furniture in order for the buyer to inspect? Answer, no. Seller not obligated to move personal property. Here's another question that comes up time and time again. Does the buyer have to give to the seller copies of all the inspections that they got? Yes. Does this include the appraisal? No. This delivery of investigation reports shall not include appraisal other than FHA or VA. So if you're an FHA or VA buyer, you do have to give the seller a copy of your appraisal. If you're a conventional loan buyer, you do not have to give the seller a copy of your appraisal. Here's another question. I'm the seller. Buyer number one did an appraisal, didn't appraise. Buyer doesn't want to buy it because it doesn't appraise. Now I put it back on the market. I had come along buyer number two. Do I have to tell buyer number two what the appraiser said about buyer number one's appraisal? No, I don't have to disclose the previous appraisal. It's not a material fact. Paragraph 13. You see this paragraph E here about this thing that if it's a buyer's an entity and there's no loan, 300,000, this only applies in certain counties: LA, San Diego, San Mateo, Santa Clara, San Francisco, Alameda. Any deal you do that's not in one of those 6 counties, you can ignore this. If you ever are doing a deal in LA County, though, for example, you're not that far from there, then you got to point out to the buyer that the title company is required to tell the Treasury Department who the real people are behind the entity. This is not the case in your county, Fresno County, any, it's not true in any county other than what I mentioned. Okay, that's a new thing, but it's probably not relevant to you. Another thing, remember I mentioned that the contingency now says if you don't get the title insurance in the contract, you can get out of the deal. So what does the contract say? The contract says buyer is always going to get the homeowner's policy if applicable. Some properties don't offer that. On the old form, it said, if you can't get the homeowner's policy, you have to talk to the title company to decide what policy you're going to get. Now look what it says. If this one's not available, you're going to get the standard CLTA. So there's choice number 1, and now there's choice number 2. Now the buyer can always request a different policy. And if it costs more than this one, the buyer has to pay the difference. But now it automatically defaults to first one. If that's not available, it automatically defaults to the second one. But what if neither one of those is available and the buyer really wants either this one or this one? The contingency for this now says they can get out of the deal. Has anything changed in paragraph 14? A few words here or there. The format has changed slightly, which I really like. Your client might ask you, hey, the buyer did this. Can I cancel them? And it's easy to find the answer now because all of the situations when a seller can cancel are listed. Or your buyer says to you, hey, can I get out of this deal? You're going to look here to see if any of these things have happened. I will say this, though. This is talking about the buyer's contractual right to cancel. Even if none of these apply, if I'm the buyer and I'm still within 5 days of receiving the NHD, the TDS, the SPQ, the lead paint form, or the fire hardening defensible space, I can still cancel. So the buyer, in addition to these contractual rights, they always have the statutory right to cancel. Okay, here's a slight change. You know how if the buyer misses a deadline or the seller misses a deadline, you got to give them a 2-day warning, notice to perform? Well, in the old form, you could say, well, I'm only going to give you 1 day notice. Now it actually says the notice to perform has to give them at least 2 days. You can give them more, you can't give them less. If you give them less, you're violating this paragraph. Okay? All right. Anything else changed there? No. 15 repairs, no change. Walkthrough, no change. Prorations, slight change. You know what a proration means? That means all the financial obligations that come due during the month of closing are prorated. So let's say you're closing on the 15th, halfway through the month, and the monthly HOA dues come due on the 20th. Well, since you're closing on the 15th, even though it comes due after the closing day, we're going to prorate the last month. So the seller's going to pay half, buyer's going to pay half. But here's something new. Look at this. Seller shall pay any HOA special or emergency assessments due prior to close. And on the other hand, buyer, following items will be assumed by buyer, special and emergency assessments that are due after close. So in other words, if it's a special assessment, if escrow is closing on the 15th and the special assessment is due on the 14th, the seller has to pay the whole thing. It's not prorated. Similarly, if escrow closing on the 15th and there's a special assessment due on the 16th, after close, buyer pays the whole thing. So you don't prorate those things anymore. 18, no change. 19, you know, the only changes here are, there's a couple things that the escrow industry asked us to put in here, like you're sort of required to cooperate with escrow. Look, for example, E, buyer and seller acknowledge escrow holder may require invoices. You know what? If they ask you, give it to them, right? If you do an amendment, give it to escrow within 3 days. I mean, buyer and seller shall execute additional instructions provided by escrow that are reasonably necessary. In other words, if escrow gives you things they want you to sign, or if they ask for, invoices, you have to cooperate. You're agreeing with the other side that both of you are going to cooperate with escrow requests. If you don't cooperate with an escrow request within the deadline, you're in breach of contract. So this is a deadline that's not in paragraph 3. This is a deadline to cooperate with the escrow holder. And it's a serious deadline. If you don't do it, the other side can give you a notice to perform. The escrow is not going to give you a notice to perform. The escrow is going to tell the other side, hey, escrow is going to tell the seller, hey, the buyer's not cooperating. And the seller would have the right to give the buyer notice to perform. Hey, you got to cooperate with escrow. Make this deal work. So that's sort of a new thing. 20 hasn't changed. 21, there's new stuff here. It talks about, sometimes buyer requests, once it closes, they say to the MLS, you need to take down some pictures. The floor plan, all these pictures I've been looking at, I don't want them on the MLS anymore. It's my house now. I don't want everybody looking at my house. And the MLS, to the extent they can, usually will accommodate you. But this paragraph is telling your clients, under the California law, there are certain images that the MLS is not allowed to take down. Second, it's telling the buyer that, some of these things are on the internet already anyway. And once something is on the internet, the MLS can't do anything about it, nor can the agents, nor can the seller. So it's just sort of telling the buyer that, okay? The assignment paragraph has been significantly updated. It used to be real short. Let's see what it says real quick. And hang in there, we're almost done. First of all, I think I mentioned this. Buyer, if you want to assign your interest to your own trust or your own corporation or your own LLC, you can just do it anytime you want. You don't need the seller's permission. You can just do it. But if you're not assigning it to your own entity, buyer shall not assign without first getting the separate written consent of the seller to the assignee. You have to tell the seller who you're assigning it to. Seller, though, they have to give you they can't unreasonably withhold their consent. But you have to tell them, disclose the name of the assignee and how much money they're giving. So what if you tell the seller who you want to assign it to, and the seller says, I know that guy, I hate that guy. That's my former neighbor. Can the seller say no to the assignment? Yeah, that's considered reasonable. You know this person, you don't like this person. That's a reasonable. Or what if the buyer says to the seller, yeah, the assignee is paying me $50,000 for this assignment. The seller may say, wait a second, I must have undersold this property. I'm not going to accept that. See what I'm saying? By the way, here's another thing. Buyer, remember, you're still going to sign this AOAA form. Buyer shall provide assignee with all the documents. However, if you're assigning it to your own entity, the assignee doesn't need to sign anything. Here's another new thing. Any assignment, if the assignee is not paying cash, the assignee is getting a loan, the assignee has to give a pre-qualification letter to the seller. That was never in this form before. You got to give a pre-qualification letter to the seller. And if you don't do that, the seller, in other words, the seller has already said, I'm okay with the assignment, but then they want the pre-qualification letter or pre-approval letter from the assignee. Assignee doesn't provide that, and they got 3 days to provide it. If they don't provide it, you can terminate the assignment. And bottom line, as I said before, you have an ultimate 17-day deadline to request assignments. If you miss that, then you're in breach of contract. All right, let's wrap this up. Nothing has changed in 24. The definitions, the only thing new is really important. I talked about delivery now. Remember, sending it is considered delivery, okay? Vera, yes, if you get a new cosigner, co-borrower, that is considered an assignment, and you do need to go through the process. Paragraph 26 and 27 haven't changed. Remember, 28 used to be called the representative capacity signatures. You don't worry about that anymore. We don't need that addendum anymore. It's just very simple. If you're signing on behalf of an entity, you are a legally authorized signer. Okay. Now, if you are a legally authorized signer, like I said back in 3, you have to provide proof to the other side that you are the right person. What if you're using a power of attorney? You got to provide a copy of the power of attorney. What if you're the president of the corporation, or you're authorized by the corporation to sign? You need the resolution. You need to provide that. All right. Liquidated damages, mediation, arbitration haven't changed. There's one little change. Let's say you want to do arbitration. You can agree now in the contract as to who the arbitrator is going to be. On the old form, it was just arbitration shall be mutually agreed by the parties. Now you can put in the offer, I want AAA arbitration, which means, of course, the seller could counter that and say, no, I want a different arbitrator. What if you don't fill that in and then it's time to arbitrate and you can't agree on the arbitrator? Judge will appoint arbitrator. Remember another important thing. If the buyer initials this and the seller doesn't, don't open escrow. You don't have a binding contract. Either they both have to initial it or neither one initials it. Okay? All right. We're almost done on the signature page now. You don't need the RCSD. If the buyer is an entity, you're just going to check the box and you're going to put the name of the person who's signing on behalf of the entity. It's that simple. You don't need the RCSD. If the buyer's a real person, you don't check the box. Then you sign it, print the name of the buyer. If it's a legally authorized signer, you print their name. Very simple. You know what's missing from 32 that you're used to? The acknowledgement of receipt box. Remember, I said you don't need that anymore because seller doesn't have to prove that you received it. All they have to prove is that they sent it, assuming that information was filled in. Sellers, same thing. If you're an entity, you're going to check the box. you're going to write the name of the entity. By the way, you know what this thing about the trust is? Let's go back to the beginning of the contract. Let's say the buyer, I'm sorry, went too far. Let's say the buyer is a trust. Let's say the buyer is a corporation. I'm sorry. Beginning of the contract. You write the name of the corporation. Let's say the buyer is an estate. You write the name of the estate. Buyer is a partnership. Write the name of the partnership. Buyer is an LLC. Write the name of the LLC. What if the buyer is a trust? You don't write the name of the trust. You write the name of the trustee. You could do both. But if I were buying your house through my trust, name of the buyer would be Gov Hutchinson, trustee of the Hutchinson Trust. You always have to say who the trustee is. Or I could just say, name of the buyer is Gov Hutchinson, trustee. And then when I get to the end of the form, where I just was in paragraph 32, then I have room to actually write the full name of the trust. So once again, any other entity other than a trust, the principal is the entity. If it's a trust, the principal is actually the trustee on behalf of the trust. And the reason for that is trust cannot hold title. Trustees hold title. Corporations can hold title. Partnership can hold title. Estate can hold title. Trust can't hold title. So the principal is the trustee of the trust. Okay? All right. We're basically done. The last page, as I already, by the way, do sellers have to fill this in? No. It's a nice thing to do. Sellers are going to do three things with your offer: accept it, counter it, ignore it. They don't have to tell you that they actually got it and are ignoring it, but it's a nice practice. It makes the buyer happy, makes the buyer's agents happy. Do it. I recommend. Okay. Last page. Sellers don't have to acknowledge offers, but agents do. Are you all aware of this? It's very clear. Buyer's agent makes an written request. Seller must confirm that the offer has been presented. So if I'm the buyer's agent, the reason I mention this is because I'm hearing on the hotline now agents complaining about they're being ghosted by the other agent. They submit an offer, they follow up, nothing happens. The code of ethics is very clear. If buyer's agent makes an offer and then you follow up your offer with, hey, listing agent, please tell me what happened to my offer. Did you tell me when you presented it? What if the seller ignores that request? File a complaint at the Association of Realtors. Seller can get fined a lot of money. And there's actually a place at the bottom of the form for the seller to do that, to acknowledge, for the listing agent to acknowledge when they presented it. What if the listing agent says they presented the offer, but they really didn't? That is a serious violation. And if you can prove that to the DRE, they'll lose their license. So it's very serious. You have the right to get your offers presented, and you have the right for the listing agent to tell you in writing when they presented it. Okay. So anyway, we're done. Remember the new thing on this last page is you guys, after you put down your broker's name, license number, your name, your license number, you give the other agent your email contact. Now, some places I've seen it's auto-filled. I don't know if it's auto-filled or not, but you can always take it out. If you don't want to fill this in, you don't have to. But remember, if you don't fill this in, we're back to the way we were before. Meaning, if I send you an email, I got to follow up and make sure you acknowledge that you received it, because if I don't do that, you can always say I never got it. If you fill this in, nobody can say that anymore. If I sent it to you, and I can always prove on my computer that I sent it. If I sent it, it's not my problem if you didn't get it. I sent it where you told me to. It's your job to check your email, open your email, and check your spam. So I just want to point with that. Vera, how do you get their initials to fit? I'm not sure what you're talking about, where you're talking about, Vera. Maybe you can email me directly. But I'm going to give everyone, oh, the trustee. Well, there's only one. I mean, are you saying maybe there's multiple trustees? If that's what you're saying, all I can say is on this contract, the good thing about zip forms is if you run out of room, you can keep typing and there's more space. Vera, call me. Great idea. And I'm going to give everybody my email address. Wait, put a J in there for some reason. govh@car.org. And I'm going to give you my phone number where you'll be able to leave a message and I'll call you back. Am I going to give you my cell phone number? No, I'm not going to give you my cell phone number unless you're really nice to me. But you can call me up and plead for it. Maybe I'll give it to you. I will. Probably not. Anyway, there we go. Email, direct line. Thanks, Maggie.